We get to learn together virtually, Baruch Hashem. So today's daf is Yud Beis 12, Meseches Kesuvos. We are picking up on Yud Aleph on the Beis 11b, and we left off in the wide lines 2, 4, 6 lines after the lines get wide. V'hadr be Rava. So remember again, Rava made the interesting approach. Rava wanted to suggest that halacha l'maisa. Rava wanted to suggest. Rava wanted to suggest that bein hikir bein lo hikir, whether the husband realized that his wife was a mukas eitz or didn't realize that she was a mukas eitz, ultimately, again, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa she's a besula and has the ksuva of 200, and the Chachamim say, ultimately, again, if it's hikirba, if he knows about that she was a mukas eitz, then ultimately she gets a moneh, 100. If it's not hikirba, he doesn't know that she was a mukas eitz, mekach tos, and she gets nothing. V'hadr be Rava. And the Gemara says, by the way, Rava retracted this position. From where do we see that Rava retracted this position? Disanya, because we learned Ketzad Otzah Shemra. What's the case of Otzah Shemra? Bal Bezin. Remember, Motzi Shemra means, as we're going to see in just a moment, where a husband puts forth an allegation against his wife, impugning her virtue, and it turns out that he claimed something falsely. So Mar says, what's the case? Bal Bezin va'amar ploni lo matzas lebitcha b'sulim. So a man comes to Bezin, Reuven marries Rachel. Reuven comes to Bezin, and he says to Rachel's father, your daughter wasn't a basula. We got married, your daughter wasn't a basula. Why? The Gemara says, Im yesh edim shezin satachtav yesh l'ksuva mana. We read this already yesterday, but just to review. If halacha l'maisa there are edim that she committed adultery, she only has a ksuva of 100. The Gemara says, what? Im yesh edim shezin satachtav baskilahi. If there are witnesses that she committed znus, that she committed adultery, forget about ksuva. She's mechuyeves and skila. That's what it means to say. If there are witnesses that she committed adultery while married to him, then einachinami, she is subject to skila. Zinsa meikari yesh l'ksuva mana. If it turns out that she had relations with another man before Eris into Ruvain, then ultimately again she gets a ksuva of 100. What does this teach us? Kinsa becheskas besula, v'nimseis bu'ula, yesh l'ksuva mana. Teaches us a very important halacha, that if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a basula, and it turns out that she's not the basula, she is entitled to a ksuva ultimately of 100, which sounds like you cannot claim mekach tos. Umasiv Rav Nachman raised the kasha, hano se'aseh isha v'lo matzah b'sulim, v'hi omeres, this is actually the next Mishnah. Rav Nachman says, a man marries a woman, and it turns out that he claims, I didn't find besulim. She says, now here's what's interesting. He omeres, mishe'irastani ne'anasti v'nistapcha sadehu. V'hu omer lo, ki ela achlo ir sotich, irastich, v'haya mikhi mekach tos. Verse of the Gemara, listen to this. In this case, he's claiming she's not a basula. She says, you're right. But she says, after Erisin, I was violated by someone. And it's your mazel. He's claiming, no, maybe you were violated even before, or you had relations even before, and it was a mekach tos. The whole thing is a mekach tos. So what's the halacha? For less lo klal, we don't give her any kind of ksuv in that situation. It sounds like that we side with him, that indeed it's a mekach tos. V'amar lehu Rav Chia bar Avin, Afsh Rav Amram v'chol Gedolei Adar Yosvi, ki Amram Sheishes lo shmaita. So Rav Chia bar Avin said, Rav Amram and all the Gedolei Adar were sitting as Rav Sheishes gave over this ruling. The kashilahu v'shani my mekach tos nami mimasayim avamona isla. And all the Gedolei Adar said, when we say it's a mekach tos means you're right. He doesn't have to give her a ksuva of 200, but he definitely has to at least give her a ksuva of 100. Va'at amrit les leklal. And right, and ultimately you're claiming that she's entitled to nothing. That doesn't make any sense. Va'amarava man de kamosiv shapir kamosiv. And Rava said, the one who raised the question asked a good question. Mekach tos legamrei mashma. When you use lashon on mekach tos doesn't sound like you go from 200 to 100. Mekach tos sounds like you go from something to nothing. Ve'elakashya, hach taritz ve'imach. Here's how I have to answer it up. Here we go. Im yesh edim shezin satachtav b'skila. If there are witnesses that after Erisin she had relations with another man other than her husband, einach inami, she's subject to skila. Zinsa meikara v'lo klum. if halacha l'maaseh it turns out that she had relations before Erusin and never disclosed this, and he became Mikudeshes to her on the condition that she is, or with the understanding that she is a Besula, that's a Mekach Tos, right? So to speak, a fraudulent transaction. And he can void it, and he's no chiyuv for any type of ksuva. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Nimtseis mukas eitz. What happens if it turns out that she was a mukas eitz? Then yeshla ksuva mana. Ultimately, she has a ksuva of a mana. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, 3 different cases. Case number 1. So the case over here is they got married. Reuven says, Rachel, not a basula. Not a basula. So case number 1 is if there are witnesses that she committed adultery after Erusin, before Nisuin, then skila. That's case number 1. Case number 2 is a situation where halacha l'maisa, case number 2 is a situation where, case number 2 is halacha l'maisa where she had relations before Erusin. Ultimately, again, in that case, mekach tos. Case number 3 is mukas eitz. What happens in mukas eitz? Mukas eitz gets a ksuva of 100 zuz. So Gemara says, but Rava was the one who said that according to the Rabbanan, if he didn't know about the mukas eitz situation, there's no ksuva, total mekach tos, and yet here, Rava is saying that for mukas eitz you get 100. You see from here that Rava retracted his position. So Rabbi say, where the Gemara is holding right now is that essentially, if she wasn't a besula, if she had relations before Erusin and never disclosed, then maybe he could claim mekach tos. We'll leave aside the skila case, the adultery cases. In a case of mukas eitz, it appears that halacha l'maisa she will at least get the ksuva of 100 moneh. Tan Rabbanan. Let's say again, Rachel married Ruvain. She married Ruvain, right? Ultimately, now the case over here, interestingly enough, if you look at Rashi, last Rashi on the Daf, the case over here is, let's say Rachel married Ruvain, right? Erusin and then Nisun went to the chuppah. But let's say Ruvain died right after the chuppah, or literally right as the chuppah was concluded. So you have witnesses that they were never alone together. Even though, right, or they were alone, but not alone long enough for something to have occurred. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? It's very interesting. Halacha l'maisa, the second husband has no tainas besulim on Rachel. Why? Because once a woman enters into Nisuin, she loses her status of a Besula, even if halacha l'maisa circumstantially we know that nothing actually occurred. A fascinating halacha. Top of Yud Beis. Amarava zos omeres, kinsa becheskas Besula, benimtsa beula, yesh la ksuva mana. What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a Besula, and it turns out that she's a beula, she has a ksuva of a mana. Now look at Rashi, Zos Ameres, the Havanta becheskas besula kinsa, the Samacha'idin, the Ka'amar, and Yachalav Sida Mana, Rela Mana Minasuan. They're both saying, where does the Gemara give this raya from? Let's play this out, right? So Rachel's married to Ruvain, they have chuppah, he dies right after the chuppah, now Shimon marries Rachel. Now when Shimon marries Rachel, why? He's marrying her, the Gemara says, out the assumption that she's a besula. After all, she was never alone with Ruvain. Yet, in that case, the halacha is that ultimately, again, there's no tainas besulim. We treat her like a non-besula, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, she has a ksuva of a mana. So the Rabbah is saying, based on this, you see from here that if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a besula, and it turns out that she's not a besula, she is still entitled to a ksuva of a mana. So Ravashi, the Gemara says, Ravashi Amar, Ba'alma, less la klal. So I will say, so Ravashi says like this. In reality, this is not necessarily the case. I'll tell you why. In general, we'll say like this: if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a besula, but it turns out that she's a beula, mekach tos. V'shayni hacha. This case is different. Why? Shari kinsa rishon. Because this woman was clearly married already. Now I will say, what does that mean? What that means is, Shimon, when you marry Rachel, you know that she was married. She had chuppah with Ruvain. It's okay, you think that she's a besula, that's fine, you can think whatever you want. But Lamaisa, our circumstances are abundantly clear. So we'll say here Rav Ashi's making a distinction. Then maybe it's in a case where essentially the husband should have known that she's not treated like a basula, where we say that even if you thought she was a basula, you're still on the hook for 100 zuz ksuva. Masha'en kain, a case where a husband had no reason to expect that his wife was not a basula. Right? Ruvain marries Rachel thinking that she's absolutely a basula. It turns out that she's not. Maybe in that case, mekach tos, and he's not subject to anything. The Gemara says, V'neicho shema tachtav zinsa. Why aren't we concerned that halacha lamaisa, maybe the wife was mezana while married to her husband? What's the case? The case ultimately again is where there was kiddushin and then bia immediately afterwards. Others go ahead and arrange this discussion on our Mishnah. Besula, almana, grusha, v'chalutza. I will say if you have a woman who is a besula, but she's a basula, is an almana, a grusha, chalutza, mina nisuin. Now again, in this case over here, these are all cases where halacha l'maisa there was nisuin, but we know the marriage wasn't consummated. Husband died at the chuppah. What's the halacha? Kesuvos almana. So I'll say it's interesting. What you see essentially is that once a woman has nisuin, that she loses basula status. Loses basula status, even if we know the marriage was not consummated. Ve'ein lahen tainos besulin, and therefore second husband can't have any tainos besulim. However, besulim in nisuin heichim mishkachos. Says Gemara, how do you ever have a case of a besula from nisuin? I could tell you, very simple. It's a case where she went into chuppah, but there was never bia. What do we see from here? If a man goes ahead and marries a woman thinking that she is a besula, and it turns out that she's a ba'ula, she still gets a ksuva of a maneh. And Rav Ashi says, not necessarily. In reality, in a general case, where a man marries a woman thinking that she was a besula, and ultimately it turns out that she's a ba'ula, she's entitled to nothing. This case of the marriage is different. Why? Because he knows she went to the chuppah. So once a woman enters into the chuppah, by definition, she loses a basula status, so to speak, if her husband were to die, even if her husband were to die immediately. Maybe we should be concerned that she had znus right after kiddushin with the second husband. The case is where in the second marriage there was kiddushin and bia immediately afterwards. Man demasni la abraisa kol shekina masnisin. Man demasni la masnisin. So the one who has this, who arranges this conversation on the braisa, would certainly be happy with the second version as well in the Mishnah. Man demasni la masnisin, but the second version that has it on the Mishnah, aval abraisa lo, would not agree. So let's say with the version that goes on the braisa, mishun dematzi amar la ana aedim samchi, because ultimately again the second husband could always say, I relied on the witnesses who said that what? You were never alone with your first husband, either never alone with him at all, or never alone for long enough that something would have occurred. So I will say a really fascinating sugya. I will say the way we paskin is we paskin that a mukas. Well, actually, we'll see. We'll actually save how we paskin on the mukas eitz. But here's what we have. Here's the unresolved issue still. Number one, what's the status of a mukas eitz? Right? Is a mukas eitz treated like a basula or like a ba'ula? That's issue number one. Again, I'm going to save this for tomorrow's daf in Mirat Hashem. We'll see the halacha lamaisa there. Issue number two is halacha lamaisa. Right? So is a mukas eitz like a basula, like a ba'ula? Issue number two is if a man marries a woman thinking that she's a basula, but it turns out that she's a ba'ula, can he claim mekach ta'os or not? So these are the two areas of machlokes. Hold on to it. We're going to resolve it in Mirat Hashem in tomorrow's daf. Or if we have time, maybe a little bit later this morning as well. So says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, ha'ochel eitzel cham b'yudis. So we've made reference to this case a number of times already. A man who would eat his meals by his father-in-law in Yehuda, referring to the tribal area of Yehuda and Eretz Yisrael. Shelo be'edim. Now, both say, as we spoke about before, in Yehuda, it was customary to go ahead and have the chassan alone with the kala. They did this that the chassan and kala should get to know each other. We're going to see an incredible Yerushalmi as to why this was done in Yehuda and not in other places. But let's read the Mishnah first. So I will say, if a person goes ahead and literally eats his meals by his father-in-law's home, meaning he's alone with his kala without Eidim, he cannot go ahead and claim after the marriage he's not a basula. In other words, once chassan and kala are alone together for long enough for something to have occurred, husband loses any right to subsequently claim that she's not a basula. Because logical, once you're alone long enough for something to occur, she may not be a basula. But lamaisa, the reason ultimately she may not be a basula is because halacha lamaisa, the husband was with her, again, granted before Nisuin, after Erusin. Says the Gemara, Mediktani ha'ochel, michlal di'ikuduchta bihudin nami delo achil. Now this is interesting. The way the Mishnah is worded is, if one eats by his father-in-law's house in Yehuda, which makes it sound like that even in the area of Yehuda, some places had this custom that the chassan and kala are alone with each other, and some places didn't have this custom that the chassan and kala are alone with each other. Amra Bayish Mamina Yehuda Nami Makamos Yesh. In Yehuda also, some places did it, some places didn't. In other words, some places had the chassan and kala alone with each other, and some locales did not. Says the Gemara, Kidisanyo, Amra Yehuda, Yehuda. Barishona hayom yachtin es chassan v'asakala sha'achas kodem knisasan l'chopa kidei sheyehi libo gaspa. This is interesting. Apparently, in the beginning, in Yehuda, what they would do is an hour before the chuppah, right? An hour before the chuppah, which shah doesn't have to mean an hour, it means some amount of time before the chuppah, they would have the chassan and kala be alone with each other. Why? Because they wanted them to develop a connection with each other. So the Gemara says, Kadesh Liyas, they want to be connected. Ubegalil lahaya osakain. But in the Galil, in the north of Eretz Yisrael, they didn't do this. So the Gemara says, Biyehuda, barishona hayu ma'amidin lahem sheisho shvinin. Echad lo ve'echad lo. V'kidei lemashmesh es hachasan ve'es hakala b'shas knisasan l'chuppah. And in Yehuda, they also had another interesting practice, which is that they would give attendance, right? In other words, they would give an attendant to the chassan, an attendant to the kala. And I both say the point of this is as follows. What we try to avoid, I know it sounds a little bit strange, is we don't want anyone making any kind of fraudulent claim. So we don't want the chassan to claim that the kala wasn't a basula when she was, and we don't want the kala to be able to claim that she was a basula when she wasn't. How would the chassan do this? The chassan would swap out the sheet. Let's say there was blood on the sheet, he would swap it out. How would the kala do it? The kala would do it by going ahead and bringing in a sheet that was stained and putting that on the marital bed already. So just in order to ensure that there's no one is trying to pull shtick, right? That no one is trying to go ahead and manipulate the other. The chassan would have his attendant, the kala would have her attendant. Good. So the Gemara says, "Ubegalil lo hayu osin kain." In the Galil, they would not do this. So the Gemara says, "Biyehuda barishon hayu shoshvini yishenim bebayi shechasan v'kala yishenim ba." This is another interesting one. In Yehuda, they had the custom that ultimately, again, that the attendants would sleep in the same house that the chassan and kala were spending their wedding night. Ubegalil lo haya osakim. In the Galil, they wouldn't do this. V'chol shelo nog minagazeh eno yachol lit on tainos besulim. And I will say so again. Anyone who did not conduct themselves in accordance with these practices could not claim tainus besulim. In other words, these were the safeguards to make sure that no one is trying to pull the wool over anyone else's eyes. If you do not abide by these practices, you lose the right to claim a tainus besulim. So the Gemara says, okay, I will say what that last phrase, whoever did not conduct themselves according to these practices, what is that referring to? Is that referring to the shoshvinin, that they have their attendants who check the room, who check the sheets? Excuse me. Or ultimately, again, is it referring to the practice of having the attendants sleep in the house? What is it referring to? To which the Gemara says, let's analyze. Ilay ma'aresha, Ultimately, again, if it's referring to the first part of the Reisha, that ultimately, again, I will say the truth is, the Reisha was really the Miyachadin, right? The idea that originally in Yehuda, they would have the Chassan and Kala alone with each other for an hour before the Chuppah. If that's the case, then it should say, Kol Shenahag Mi Baile. It should say that anyone who conducted themselves in accordance with this practice, i.e., the Chassan and Kala were alone with each other, there's no longer the ability to claim a Tainas Besulim. Ella as-Seifa. Rather, it must be going on the Seifa. If that's the case, Kol Shelo Mushmash Mi Baile. It should say anyone who was not taken care of by the attendants cannot go ahead and make a Tainas Besulim. Amra Abaye, the Olam HaReisha. Really, it's going on the first part. On the custom of having Yichud. Vitani Kol Shenahag. And the way to read it is Kol Shenahag. Whoever conducted themselves this way, i.e., that the Chassan and Kala were alone with each other before the Chuppah, ultimately, again, you lose Tainas Besulim. Amar le Rava, Vaha Kol Shelo Nahag Katani. That's not what it says. It says whoever did not conduct themselves in accordance with this practice doesn't have a Tainas Besulim. Ela Amar Rava Hachi Kamar. Kol Shelo Nahag Minhag Galil Begalil. Ela Minhag Yehuda Begalil. Eino Yachal Liton Tainas Besulim. What it means is like this. Whoever did not act like the people of the Galil, but rather acted like the people of Yehuda in the Galil, which means in the Galil, they did not have the Chassan and Kala alone with each other. So if you're living in the Galil, but you conducted yourself like Bnei Yehuda, and the Chassan and Kala were alone with each other before the Chuppah, you lose the opportunity for Tainas Besulim. Rav Ashi on the Olam HaSeifa, Rav Ashi says, no, go on the Seifa, Vitani Kol Shelo Mushmash, and change it to say whoever was not serviced by the attendants ultimately has no Tainas Besulim. So I will say, the point over here is that Allah said to highlight the fact that there were different practices, and even in Yehuda itself, there were different practices. Now, what's clear is Yehuda had this unique practice of going ahead and having the Chassan and Kala alone with each other prior to the Chasana. And again, this stated prior to the Nisuin. After Erusin, prior to the Nisuin. And again, the logic behind that was what? Was in order to create the connection between Chassan and Kala. But of course, once they're alone with each other long enough for something to have occurred, so you would not have Tainas Besulim. I will say, what is the source of this practice? I sent it out on the chat, a copy of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi Meseches Kesuvos, Perek Aleph Halacha Hey, discusses this practice, and this is absolutely amazing. I'm going to read to the Yerushalmi. He says, Berishona, the Yerushalmi says, Berishona, and this is on the chat, Berishona Gazru Shmad Bi Yehuda. Let me just say this outside. The Yerushalmi says like this, there was a decree. Now, the Yerushalmi doesn't indicate to us at what point in time this decree occurred, but the truth is, we see this by both the Greeks as well as by the Romans. The decree that a Kala on her wedding night would spend her first night with the local governor. And so I will say, it's amazing. And apparently, this practice, the Yerushalmi says, most acutely affected the area of Yehuda. I guess that's where the Greco-Roman forces were primarily concentrated. See how this incredible, overwhelming gezerah. In fact, I want to point out, in the Megillas Chashmonaim, the Megillas Chashmonaim says that one of the things that sparked the Hasmonean revolt, right, the rebellion of the Chashmonaim, was this decree that ultimately every Jewish girl on her wedding night, instead of spending her wedding night with her husband, would spend her wedding night with the local Greek governor. So it sparked the Chashmonaim revolt. So in Yehuda, they were concerned that this would impact the relationship between husband and wife. So what would they do? They wanted husband and wife to go ahead and form a connection with each other before the wedding night. Now, the goal wasn't relations. That actually wasn't the goal. Although, interestingly enough, from the Lashon of the Yerushalmi, is actually that Bala Ba'aleha. From the Yerushalmi, it actually sounds like the intention was actually for them to have relations, but the Gemara just seems to indicate that the intention was that they should have a connection with each other, that there should be a relationship with each other. So even if she would have to undergo that horrific ordeal with the local governor on the wedding night, she would have a pre-established relationship with her husband. Such an incredible yesod. The Pnei Moshe, I underlined if you underline, also brings down this idea that also like this, it's clear that her going to the local governor is against her will. Since she has a previous relationship with her husband, going to the local governor her wedding night is against her. It's ones. It's ones. And therefore, ultimately, again, she'll be permitted to her husband. Of course, this works for wives of Yisraelim, wives of Kohanim. The Yerushalmi discusses those women would actually go into hiding and would not go to the local governor because halacha l'maisa, they would be asur to their husbands. So without getting into all the details, just want to point out that historically, there was a reason for this in Yehuda. It was because of this gzeira by the Greeks and the Romans. They wanted a husband and wife to have a relationship prior to the trauma, which, by the way, is also such an incredible yesod, right? That you see this sometimes in relationships, that where there is a foundation, and then the traumatic event occurs afterwards, ultimately, again, the foundation is able to go ahead and steady the couple and hold the couple together even past the traumatic event. So in Yehuda, they want the chassan and kala to have a foundation, have a relationship. We know this traumatic event is going to occur, but hopefully the foundation that they create together ultimately is able to steady them through the traumatic event. Incredible. You'll take a look at a fascinating read of the Yerushalmi. You'll take a look. Says the Mishnah, Achas almanas Yisrael, Achas almanas Kohanim, Kesuvos amana. So we'll say both the almana of Yisrael and the almana of Kohanim ultimately again has a ksuva of 100 zuz of amana. Based in Shal Kohanim hayu goven l'psula arba meos zuz v'lo michu b'yad chanbos is actually an incredible halacha. So the Gemara says is like this. And whether an almana is a bas kohen, or ultimately again an almana is just a Yisrael, ultimately again for second marriage, the ksuva is 100 zuz. The ksuva is 100 zuz. But interestingly enough, the Mishnah now records a practice that the Beis Din of Kohanim they used to institute that if you were marrying a besula from a Kohanic family, that girl got a ksuva 400 zuz. It's like the ma'ala asu b'kuhuna. That ultimately, again, it appears that halacha l'maisa, that a bas kohen was considered to be like royalty. Sorry, bas kohen was considered to be like royalty, and therefore halacha l'maisa, they put her ksuva at 400 zuz. Twice the price, twice the amount of a normal ksuva. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "V'lo michu b'yadam chacham." The Chacham didn't object to this practice. Says the Gemara, Tana, va'almanas kohanim ksuvas masayim. Right? We learned that the almana of a kohuna is an almana of a kohuna, an almana who is a bas kohen gets a ksuva of 200 zuz. So what's going on over here? Our Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, an almana who's a bas kohen gets a ksuva of 100 zuz. Yet again, the Bryce here says that she gets a ksuva of 200 zuz. What's going on? So listen to this. This is incredible. So Tana v'almanas kohanim ksuva. I'm sorry. V'anan tana we learned achas almanas Yisrael ve'achas almanas kohanim ksuvas almana. But our Mishnah said an almana is an almana. Second marriage gets 100 zuz. What's going on? Rav Ashi shtei takanos havu. Incredible. There are two different enactments. Meikara takinu lebsula arba meos zuz ula almana mana. Supposed to listen to this. In the beginning, the Beis Din of Kohanim said that if you are marrying a besula bas kohen, her ksuva was 400 zuz. If you are marrying an almana bas kohen, her ksuva was 100 zuz, like a regular almana. Amud beis, kevan dechazu demizal zulubahu. Since people, then when the Beis Din of Kohanim saw that what? That halacha l'maisa, people were treating an almana bas kohen with not enough respect because her ksuva was just a regular second marriage ksuva. The Gemara says, now by the way, what it means is that one of the reasons of a ksuva, Rashi points out over here, is that a husband should think twice before divorcing his wife because it's going to cost him. Well, if it only costs him 100 zuz, he didn't really think about it. But this would be true both for an almana of a bas kohen and an almana Yisrael. It's true. But Kohanim have a higher standing within Klal Yisrael. So the Beis Din of Kohanim were concerned that the almana bas kohen was being treated disrespectfully, or could potentially be disregarded, right? Be discarded, I should say, be divorced relatively easily. To which the Gemara says, what happened? Takimeluhu masan. They upped the ksuva of an almana bas kohen to 200 zuz. Here was the problem. Kevan dechazu dava karparshim minayu. Damri ad dinas binon almonas kohanim nezel nese besula bas Yisrael. Then what happens? They saw people stop marrying an almona bas kohen. Why? Because if, again, on a very just transactional level, a man says, if I'm going to have to pay 200 zuz for a ksuva, I can marry a besula bas Yisrael. Why should I marry an almona bas kohen for the same ksuva value? Again, not a very romantic approach to marriage, but okay, right? Why should I marry an almona bas kohen for 200 zuz when I can marry a besula for 200 zuz? Therefore, a hadrin l'mol saihu. Ultimately, again, therefore, halacha l'maisa, they restored it back to what it was, and therefore, again, I will say, and that's our Mishnah. That's why our Mishnah says, even an almona bas kohen only gets a ksuva of 100 zuz. Let's go back to Beizin Shal Kohanim. So we'll say, then the Mishnah said, the Beizin of Kohanim decided that a besula bas kohen should get a ksuva of 400 zuz. And the Chachamim did not object. Now we'll say, why did they institute 400 zuz? This was to reflect her royal and regal standing as a bas kohen. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, lo Beizin Shal Kohanim bilvad. The truth is, this is not just the din in Beizin of Kohanim. So the Gemara says, Ela afilu mishpachos hamiyuchasos b'Yisrael. We'll say, let's say you had a family of very distinguished lineage, and that family decided that for our daughters, we demand the ksuva of 400 zuz. In ratzu lasos keder shakohanim osin. All right, you could do that if you want to. In other words, let's say, remember again, you could legislate whatever you want. So if a family that has very distinguished lineage, right? David HaMelech's mishpacha, they're not Kohanim, but they're David HaMelech. So if David HaMelech decided that for his family, he wants to say, if you want to marry one of our daughters, her ksuva is 400 zuz, great, you could take it or leave it, right? Again, you could do that. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, is that true? We learned, Harotza lasos kedar shakanim osin kegom bas Yisrael kohen, ubas kohen li Yisrael osin. So we'll say we learned elsewhere in the Brisa that if one wants to conduct themselves like the Kohanim, meaning what? That if a Bas Yisrael is going to marry a Kohen, or a Bas Kohen is going to marry Yisrael Osin, they could demand a higher ksuva. So the Gemara says, Bas Yisrael le Kohen, u Bas Kohen li Yisrael hu di'iket tzad kahuna. Ava Bas Yisrael li Yisrael lo. That I will say, if you look at the examples the Brisa gives of inflated ksuva amounts, that's where there's a tzad kahuna. Someone's a Kohen. A Yisrael is marrying a Kohen, a Bas Kohen marrying a Yisrael. That's where it sounds like you have a right to go ahead and inflate the value of a ksuva. But just stop. Let's say you have a very distinguished mishpacha. So you want to say, my daughter should get 400 zuz. It doesn't sound like you could do that. To which the Gemara says, Lo mi bai kamar. No. Lo mi bai bas Yisrael, li Yisrael de lo matzi amar, lo ilu ye kama alina lech. Ava bas Yisrael the kohen de matzi amar le, ilu ye kama alech le, emalo. So we'll say, no, here's the chiddush. You would have thought that when a Bas Yisrael is marrying a Kohen, maybe she has no right, family has no right to demand a higher ksuva, because the husband could claim, look, I'm doing you a favor. I'm taking you, right, from being a simple Yisraelis to now you're going to be the wife of a Kohen. I would have thought in that case, perhaps she cannot demand a higher ksuva. Kamash Malo, no, even in that case, she could demand a higher ksuva. And all the more so, even when you have one Yisrael marrying another Yisrael. But let's say the girl is from a distinguished family, her family has the right to go ahead and demand a higher value ksuva. And I will say, this is halacha l'maisa. Remember, again, it's not a chiddush. A girl could ask for whatever she wants, right? The girl's family could ask for it. They could demand whatever they want. Maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't. But Lamaisa, they could demand it. And certainly, again, the same way that the Beizin of Kohanim said, if you're marrying a Besula Bas Kohen, that's Chashivos, she's Jewish royalty, so she should get a ksuva 400 zuz. So if there was a family of mishpachas miyuchasas, right, a family of exceptional lineage, or someone else, some other unique quality, and they wanted to say our daughters should go ahead and get 400 zuz, they have the right to ask for that as well. Incredible. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say, we actually quoted this Mishnah before. A man marries a basula, and what happens? He marries a basula, v'lo matzala basulim, and if he can't find any basulim, can't find that she's a basula, he omeres mishe'erastani ne'enasti v'nistap chosadeu. She claims, I was a basula, but I was violated after erisin, and nistap chosadeu, literally your field has flooded. It's your mazel. It's your mazel. She says to her husband, it's your mazel. V'hu omer lo, ki ela ad shelo arastich, haya, erastich, v'haya mechi mekach tos. He claims, no. You had relations before we even had erisin, and therefore it's a mekachtos, because I thought I was marrying a basula, and it turns out you're not a basula, you're a beula. So we'll say who's right. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, ne'emenes, she is believed. She is believed. Right? So we'll say, she's claiming, you're right, I'm not a basula, but I was violated after Erisin. He's claiming, no, you were violated before Erisin. Right? You're violated before Erisin. She's ne'emenes, she is believed. I will say, why is she believed? Look at Rashi. Fourth line down in Rashi. This is very interesting. So we'll say the Gemara is making the following assumption. We have a concept bari v'shema, which is when you have two claims. One is a possible claim, one is a definitive claim. The possible claim always wins. So we'll say, let's analyze this. In this case, perhaps we could say, she claims, I was violated after Erisin. He claims, no, you were violated before Erisin. Now we'll say, his claim that she was violated before Erisin is not a definitive claim. He can't prove it. I mean, if he has witnesses, then the whole discussion is over. If you have witnesses, you have witnesses. He has no witnesses. He's making a claim of possibility. That's called a shema, a possibility. She's claiming bari. I'm telling you definitively what happened to me. So whenever you have two claims, one is a bari, one is a shema, the bari will always win over the shema. Therefore, she is believed in this particular case. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, lo mi pia anu chayin. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, we don't live based on what she says. Ela harezu becheskas beula ad shalotis ares vit aso ad shetavi rai lidvareha. So Rabbi say, this is incredible. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, not true. Who says we should believe her? Should we believe her? Right? Lamaisa. Rabbi say, here's what we know. He thought she was a basula. She's not a basula. The burden of proof is upon her that what she claims occurred did in fact occur. Otherwise, halacha lamaisa, we have to assume that she had relations before Erisin, and therefore it's a mekachtal. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. Let's analyze. Se'itmar says the Gemara, mana li biyadachavala omer eini yodea. So listen to this case. Right? Ruvain says to Shimon, you owe me $1,000. Right? Shimon says, I don't know. Right, so he doesn't say no. He doesn't say. He just says, I don't know. I don't remember any such transaction. Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna, Amri chayiv. Rav Huna say that you're chayiv. Right, when I say chayiv, that Shimon is chayiv to pay Reuven $1,000. Rav Nachman, Rabbi Yochanan, Amri pater. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan say you're pater. Okay, what's going on over here? What's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Amri chayiv. So why did Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda say chayiv? Bari v'shema, bari adif. Because what do you have over here? Bari v'shema, a definitive claim and an undefinitive claim. A possible claim. Reuven saying to Shimon, you owe me $1,000. Shimon says, I don't know. So you have a definitive claim against a possible claim. Bari v'shema, bari adif. Therefore, Reuven's claim is stronger. Therefore, Shimon has to pay Reuven $1,000. Uki mamona becheskas marei. So let's listen to this. Rav Nachman Rabbi Yochanan say, listen, it's pater. Why? Because again, you have a machlokes, right? Reuven saying you owe me, Shimon saying I don't know. When in doubt regarding monetary issues, what do we do? And obviously, if Reuven brings witnesses or Reuven produces a document, that might be something else, right? But Lamais, again, all Reuven is making a claim. Shimon's not disagreeing or agreeing, he's just saying I don't know. So in this case, Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan will say, when in doubt, keep the money where it presently is. And where is the money right now? In Shimon's pocket. Sa'uki mamona b'cheskas marei. Establish the money under the ownership of the person who has the current chazaka, which is Shimon. I will say fundamental machlokes. Amalei by the Rav Yosef. Sabai said Rav Yosef, Had Rav Huna Rabbi Yehuda. That which Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda said. Remember, Rav Huna and Rabbi Yehuda were the ones who say chayiv, because bari v'shema bari adif. So the Gemara says, Had Rav Huna Rabbi Yehuda the Shmuel he. This is the same position as Shmuel. What did Shmuel say? This nan. Haisem ubaris, if an unmarried woman was pregnant, va'amrullah, we say to her, mativo shal ubarzeh. First white line. Tell me, what's the identity of this kid? In other words, who's the father of this baby? So the Gemara says, mi ish ploni v'kohen. When she claims the father of this child is so and so, and he's a kohen. Rabbi Eliezer omrim ne'emenes. Rabbi Eliezer says that she is believed. She is believed. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Yehuda is the name of Shmuel. The halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel. Va'amri lei Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Rav Yehuda Shinina. So I will say Rav Yehuda. So I'm sorry. Va'amri lei Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said to Rav Yehuda Shinina, sharp one, which is a compliment, right? Talmud Chacham Shinina. Amart lon mishmei Shmuel halacha Rabbi Gamliel af barishona. We learned that the halacha follows Rabbi Gamliel even in the earlier case. Even in the earlier case, that I will say. Now, what's the earlier case? Rashi says, Gabe Tevias Ksuvasa, right? The Pashtus again, which is a reference to the case in the Mishnah. Halacha Vazar ben Gamliel, even in the case of the Mishnah. Ultimately, again, that halacha lemaisa, that she is believed, right? Based on Bari V'Shema Bari Adif. So the Gemara says, my af barishona. Because remember again, going back to the case of the Mishnah, right? Remember again, Ruvain marries Rachel. She's not a basula. Ruvain says you had relations before Erisin Mekachtos. Rachel says I was violated after Erisin. It's your mazel. Your field got flooded. Rabbi Gamliel said we believe her. We believe her. Even though you could say Uki Mamona Becheskas Marei, keep the money where it, right, in the possession of who has it. Who has it? Who has it? Ruvain, the husband has it. Nevertheless, we say Bari V'Shema Bari Adif. She's making a definitive claim. He's making only a possible claim. Therefore, her claim wins over his claim. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Gamliel Bari Adif. So even though you could say Uki Mamoni, so you have this clash of, on one hand, if you say Uki Mamoni Becheskas Marei, when in doubt, keep the money where it is, that would keep the money with Reuven, the husband, that he wouldn't have to pay anything. If you say Bari V'Shema Bari Adif, then ultimately Rachel's claim is stronger than Reuven's claim. She's making a definitive claim. I was violated after Erisin, and he's claiming maybe I had relations before Erisin. So Rabbi Gamliel clearly says that Bari wins over Uki Mamoni V'Cheskas Marei. So Leimer Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna the Amrik Rabbi Gamliel. So we'll say, let's say that Rav Yehuda and Rav Huna hold like Rabbi Gamliel. Rav Nachman Rabbi Yochanan the Amrik Rabbi Yoshua, and Rav Nachman Rabbi Yochanan hold like Rabbi Yoshua. Amalach Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman will say, Ana Da'amri Afiluk Rabbi Gamliel. The truth is, I could even hold like Rabbi Gamliel. How so? Ad Kanu Kam Rabbi Gamliel Hasam Ela Diika Migo. See Rabbi saying, in the case of the Mishnah, the reason Rabbi Gamliel believes her is because there's a migo. I will say migo means what? Migo means when you make a claim, and we know you could have made even a better claim that would have made you even more believable, but you make the inferior claim, you're believed. In this case, Rabbi say when Reuven marries Rachel and it turns out that she's not a basula, she could have made a different claim. What was the different claim? She could have claimed, I'm a mukas eitz. And let's assume, at least according to some, mukas eitz still has the designation as a basula. So she could have claimed mukas eitz, but she didn't. Instead, she claims that she was violated after Erisin. So the fact that she didn't make the best claim possible lends credibility to the claim that she made. Aval hacha, my migo ego. But I will say in this case over here, where halacha lemaisa, ultimately, again, by the borrowing of the money, what migo is there, right? What migo is there? To which the Gemara says, inami, the other possibility is, I'm sorry. Right, migo. I'm sorry. Inami ad kamo kam Rabbi Gamliel hasam ela darmin ukma chazaka. What about the other possibility is by the borrowing of the money case? The reason we say that Shimon doesn't have to pay is because uki mamoni becheskas marei. Aval hacha my chazaka is like. But over here, what chazaka is there? So the Gemara says hachanai mistabekid. I'm sorry. Aval hacha my chazaka islay lahai. What chazaka is there? To which the Gemara says, look at Rashi. My chazaka islay lahai. Last Rashi tovea. To nukmi achazake legabos hilchach zil basar chazaka demamona. Good. To which the Gemara says, "Hachinami mistabra." This seems to be clear. Why kid the kamishaninon to Rav Nachman who the Amar Rabbi Gamliel. So we'll say this seems to be clear as we explained. That Rav Nachman holds like Rabbi Gamliel. How so? Top of Yud Gimel. The imkein kash hilchasa. Otherwise, you're going to run into a contradiction between halachas. The kaim alon halacha Rav Nachman bedini. On one hand, we hold that the halacha follows Rav Nachman bedini monetary law. Ubaha Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Gamliel. Elalav shmamina kidimishaninon shmamina. In other words, you have to say with the resolution that we said before, and indeed, this is the proper resolution. So I will say, I'll just point out something very interesting. That halacha lemaisa. First of all, let's work backwards. In the case where Reuven goes over to Shimon and says to Shimon, you owe me $1,000, and Shimon says, I don't know. They both say we paskin like Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan that halacha lemaisa Shimon is pater from paying. Why? Because we say uki mamona becheskas marei. We keep the money. Where ultimately, again, the Chazaka tells us, which is in the pocket of Shimon, and unless Reuven could produce some type of more uncontestable proof, halacha lemaisa Shimon doesn't have to pay anything. That's Aleph. Rabbi say, what about in our particular Mishnah? So Rabbi say, in our Mishnah, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Gamliel. So Rabbi say, so I just want to point out, so we subscribe to the concept of uki mamona becheskas mare, right? In monetary law, that's how we do subscribe to that concept. That's why Shimon doesn't have to pay anything. What about in our case? In our case in the Mishnah, where halacha lemaisa, Reuven marries Rachel. Turns out she's not a basula. Rachel says, "You're right, I'm not a basula, but here's what happened. Ultimately, I was violated after Erisin. Nistapcha sadeh, your field became flooded. It's your mazel. It's your mazel." He says, "Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you had relations before Erisin. The whole thing is a mekach tos." To which Rabbi Gamliel says, halacha l'maisa in the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel says, which is how we paskin, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, that she is ne'emanes, she is believed. Why? Because bari v'shema bari adif. Halacha l'maisa, when you have two claims, one is definitive, and ultimately, again, one is possible. So halacha l'maisa, we go with the definitive claim. We go with the definitive claim over the possible. She's making the definitive claim that I was violated during Erisin. He's making the possible claim. Maybe it was before Erisin, and therefore mekach tos. Therefore, we side with her. They both say, so why do I? So you'll see over here. What about? Let's go back 1 second. What about the case where Reuven goes over to Shimon, and Reuven says, "Shimon, you owe me $1,000." And what? And Shimon says, I don't know. So why don't we say bari v'shema bari adif? Remember, there we have a different principle. Monetary law, that's what the Gemara says on the top of Yud Gimel. Hilchusak Rav Nachman Bedini. The halacha follows Rav Nachman in cases of monetary law. Right? And I will say, Rav Nachman says that ultimately, again, uki mamona becheskas mare. So even though from a bari v'shema, right, perspective, so really Shimon should have to pay Reuven because Reuven is making a definitive claim. Shimon is making a possible claim. Nevertheless, in monetary law, we paskin like Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman says, "Uki mamona becheskas mare." When in doubt, keep the money, or in the absence of a provable claim, ultimately keep the money in the chazaka of the one who was in possession of it. All right, we'll stop here. I just want to add in just one last ta'ara. Just going back to what the Yerushalmi was saying before. I wanted to get to the end of the daf first before I said this. What the Yerushalmi was saying about the concept of that in Yehuda they would allow the wife to go ahead, the arusa, to be alone with her husband before nisuin, in order to build the marital bond, even though we know that seclusion, that yichud, might lead to bia, right? And bia before nisuin is certainly not ideal. So halacha l'maaseh, it was so important for them to create a relationship, because everyone knew the trauma that was coming, and if you build the foundation of the relationship, then the relationship could hopefully weather the trauma. And I will say, this is not just true in marriage, it's also true in our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because it happens in our relationship with Hashem that our relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom suffers trauma. It happens, I will say. A person has a loss. A person has a setback. A person suffers a devastating defeat. And in those moments when life really doesn't go my way, it's normal to feel like, Keli, lama azavtani, Kadosh Baruch Hu, where did you go? You know, what happened? My relationship with Hashem suffers a trauma. The Chazal tell us, how do you ensure that your life relationships, in this case now, my relationship with Hashem, is able to endure even past trauma? You have to build on it in times of good. You have to make sure that it's solid. See, I will say, people sometimes think that you find God in the midst of trauma, in the midst of traumatic experiences, difficulties in life. It's not true. Because the truth is, when a person is undergoing trauma, so often all of my effort and all of my energy is just devoted to keeping myself afloat, to keeping my head above water, to keeping myself alive. I have no time for anything else, no bandwidth for anything else. The time to build a relationship with Hashem is when life is good, is when there are no difficulties. There are never no difficulties. But when there's no trauma, there's no upheaval. Baruch Hashem, life is good, things are going well. That's the time to plug away in building a meaningful relationship with Hashem. That's when you build the foundation. Don't wait until there's an acute situation to find God, because when there's an acute situation, you're going to have to use all of your energy just to steady yourself. You might not even have a moment to think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But when times are good, before the chuppah, before the nisuin, before the night with the Greek governor, that's the time to build a relationship with Hashem. I will say, it's so incredibly important. When life is good and things are going okay, that's the time to redouble our efforts in creating a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. Because if we put in the effort to build the foundation when life is quiet and tranquil and things are good, then when the traumatic experiences come, which they will, the relationship will survive. the relationship will be able to weather the storm. Not only that, not only will the relationship endure and survive, but the relationship itself will prove as a source of consolation, a source of, it'll be an anchor. It'll be something I could hold on to, even during those times of life turbulence. An incredible Musar Haskell from the Minhag of Bnei Yehuda. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Can't wait for tomorrow. Thank you. Shkoyach and Kol Tov. A zechus with all of you.